Food prices, energy bills, the cost of living in the UK is still high, but the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rachel Reeves, is promising targeted action to help.
We recognise that the cost of living is still a challenge for many people, families and pensioners as well, and that's why we're taking targeted action to deal with those challenges.
Where could she make a difference? And also, what can she afford as the custodian of the nation's finances? We'll discuss on this episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio, and shortly we will catch up with Frank Gardener, our security correspondent, because the head of MI5 has been doing his annual speech, and he's been talking about China. What a week to be doing an annual speech about security where you talk about China. Frank Gardener will reveal all. But first of all, we're going to talk about the economy and we're going to talk about the public finances, because the budget speculation is in full swing ahead of Rachel Reeves' next budget on November the 26th. Two things have been happening today. One is in Washington, where the big international meetings of all the big international economic organizations and finance ministers have been taking place. The other thing that's happening is the publication of the so-called Green Budget. This is when the Institute for Fiscal Studies do kind of their version of the challenges that Rachel Reeves might have to address in her budget. So let's join the two things together, because we're joined from Washington by Faisal Islam, as promised, because it's Groundhog Day. Hi, Faisal.
Hello, Adam.
What are you actually doing in DC?
Well, I'm at the IMF annual meetings, and essentially that's the world's finance ministers, the central bankers, every single country in the world. And on top of that, basically all the world's top bankers too, all kind of come along and fill up Washington DC. Actually, Washington needs filling up because the government is shut down here, and there's not a lot of activity in the US government, but it's full of the world's major financial figures, including the Chancellor Rachel Reeves.
And we will talk about your interview with her in a minute. But we're also joined in the studio by Helen Miller, who is the very new director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Hello.
Hello, thank you.
On your way to national treasure status.
Let's hope so.
How's the new job going?
It's exciting, yeah. It's intense.
Yeah.
That's what I expected, but it's exciting.
But you've been at the IFS for a while, doing other bits and bobs there.
I've been there like 18 years now, so
right.
yeah, the IFS isn't new, but the director job is new.
And I mean this in the nicest possible way. You're a tax nerd.
Oh, absolutely. Fully fledged.
But now you've got to be an everything nerd.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I've been at the IFS for a long time, right? So the thing I've specialised in is tax, but I've been thinking about broader public policy for a long time too.
So you guys released your Green Budget today, which is kind of your take on the public finances and the economy, and just raising some of the issues that Rachel Reeves will have to grapple with when she does her own budget in November. The headline on the press release is about Groundhog Day and the danger of Groundhog Day. Great film, maybe not a great thing for the public finances. Just explain why.
Yeah, so basically, I mean, Rachel Reeves, some of us will remember, came to power saying, I don't want to raise taxes. Then in her first budget, she raised taxes before quickly saying, I don't want to raise taxes again. And now we're back in a situation where I think it's widely expected that she will be looking at tax rises. Basically, that's because the Office for Budget Responsibility is almost certain now, I think, to hand her a downgrade to her forecast. Basically, she's trying to make sure that revenues at least meet day-to-day spending in coming years. I think the forecasts have been blown off course. And therefore, she's back in the situation, back in this Groundhog Day of having to once again look to either cut spending or raise taxes.
And Faisal, just explain to us what some of the factors going into the economy are that means that's what the position might be.
Yeah, I mean, the big one is that the OBR is going to reassess in this budget forecast, the budget maths, that the growth of the economy over the long term, it has not been quite what it predicted before, and this has a mathematical impact on that sort of room for manoeuvre in the budget maths that it has been calculated. But on top of that, you have U-turns, and you also have what had been an increase in the cost of government borrowing. It's come down a little bit actually in the past couple of weeks. You put that all into the mixer and you get a further squeeze. It's quite interesting, both on those issues about Groundhog Day that Helen has mentioned. The mood music in the background, we get a lot of conversations in a place like this, is about changes to the way this sort of calculation has done, because I think there's some recognition, I'll put it like that, from the Treasury, from the top of the Treasury. This Groundhog Day hasn't exactly added to stability. You don't want this constant process. Frankly, you don't want people like me responding to every move in the inflation number or whatever, or the growth number, month to month. with a commentary on what it means for likely tax rises. That's not great for consumer confidence. It's not great for business confidence generally. So I think there is an attempt to change some of the nerdy processology around this in order that what happens at the budget can kind of put things to bed for some months to come. And that could mean a tweak to how the sort of forecasts operate. Could also mean consideration of increasing the buffers. The buffers have been very tight by historical standards, so I think those are the considerations, but a lot depends on what exactly the job that the OBR say is necessary. Those numbers are coming out. There's another draft on Monday. The IFS have done their version of this draft. A lot depends on how much space there is.
Also, Helen, it's interesting reading your document today that one of the ways Rachel Reeves could make her life a bit easier, and rather than having this 6-monthly scramble for some tax rises or some spending cuts or some other way to measure the size of the pie, is to get the OBR to do one less forecast per year. Who knew that was like the silver bullet to make Rachel Reeves' life so much easier? Why is something that sounds as nerdy as that an answer?
Well, I think it's not an answer, actually. I mean, I think it's so basically, the argument goes that we have 2 forecasts a year, and the second forecast means that the OBR might tell Rachel Reeves that things have got worse and has to take action. If you just scrap that, then no forecast, no problem. The problem I have with that is that it would be a huge blow to transparency. You'd be taking information out of the public debate away from MPs. It's also the case that other people, like us, could still work out roughly what was going on with the public finances. So you wouldn't be hiding it completely.
You'd still have the pressure from people doing their own calculations.
Yeah. And also, importantly, even if you got rid of the spring forecast, we could be here this time next year, right? We could be back in the situation with the next budget where something needs to be done. I think what Faisal was talking about this so-called headroom, the kind of buffer against your rules. Rachel Reeves is operating with teeny tiny headroom. I mean, really, really small.
Well, I mean, it's £9 billion, isn't it? Which to a normal person is a lot of money, but to a government is not a lot.
It's not. To give you an analogy to make you realise how small it is, it's like me asking you to guess what, or estimate the value of your house in 3 or 4 or 5 years' time. And let's imagine you tell me you think your house is roughly £300,000. But I'm going to say you have to forecast it within £1,000 accuracy. That's the kind of equivalent of what Rachel Reeves is trying to do. Of course she's going to be wrong, because no one gets to be that accurate with a forecast that's in 5 years' time about something as big and complex as the economy. But because she's leaving herself very little wiggle room, even very normal, ordinary, run-of-the-mill forecast change. And what the OBR is about to do is the kind of size of what they're looking at is the kind of forecast revision we've seen at least 8 times since 2010. This is not something unusual happening. It's really happening because she had no wiggle room.
Let's talk about another number which you guys have crunched, which is the amount of tax rises or spending cuts or policy changes Rachel Reeves would have to come up with so she could meet her fiscal rules in this new economic environment. And the number you've come up with is?
If you want one number, 22.
Billion.
Yeah, billion. Yeah.
Pounds. That would be very easy.
Yeah, the scale matters here. Yeah, billions. So look, it's really important to emphasise that the number that will really matter for Rachel Reeves is the one that the OBR comes up with. And, ever so slight differences in forecast judgments about what do you think productivity will be in 5 years' time could make a big difference. So I suspect the OBR won't come up with the same number. It could be a bit bigger, it could be a bit smaller. But that's the kind of ballpark you should be thinking. And what does that number mean? It means that Rachel Reeves would need to do some combination of cutting spending or raising taxes to the tune of about 22 billion or thereabouts in order to leave herself the same amount of headroom she had last year. If she wants to go further and have bigger headroom, she'd need to do more.
But you also reckon she could raise that £22 billion without having to break her manifesto commitments to not increase national insurance, income tax or VAT?
Yes, in the sense that if you just mechanically look at where you can get taxes from, yes, you could raise that much money. Doesn't mean it would be easy. I mean, to give you a sense of scale about what you might be able to do, let's say you could put 5 billion on council tax, 5 billion on inheritance tax. Maybe you can get 5 billion by cutting back on the tax gap on corporation tax for small companies. Maybe you can
in other words, the amount of tax that should be collected.
But that's hard to do. Maybe you can get a few billion from taxes on banks or sin taxes. So look, mechanically you could get the money, but I don't think that would be easy either. I mean, a small tax increase on farmers last year, inheritance tax wasn't
caused
popular.
A lot of political heat. Yeah.
So look, you could do it mechanically. I think the question for the Chancellor really is not how can she get away with scraping this money from behind the Treasury sofa. It really should be what are the best measures? What should she do? And obviously that's a political choice. But some of our taxes are poorly designed, which means that if you just increase them, you also have a particularly bad drag on growth. So as well as just thinking, how can you get the money, thinking about, is there a better way to get the money?
Good to see the IFS has got a new boss, but still banging the drum for a simpler tax system.
Yeah.
Faisal, that figure that Helen's just given us there of £22 billion that Rachel Reeves might have to grapple with, that to me seems a bit lower than lots of other observers, some of whom have been saying it's maybe 30 billion plus she's going to have to do.
Yes, and we were able to sort of test those sorts of numbers out in conversations in the corridors around here. And I guess the mood music is, and it's only been the first official numbers that the Treasury have got internally. There's another 2 forecasts before they then give their measures, the actual measures for the budget in early November. And I do get the sense that maybe that those 50 billion, 30 billion numbers were kind of overstatements, and right now the situation isn't great, but it's not quite as dire, and so that's why you're hearing some options that may look a little bit, unlikely in a tight situation starting to be talked about, and indeed the Chancellor trying to reset the conversation away just from tax rises. Part of the problem is not getting the animal spirits of the economy going, and it's because we're in this constant doom loop chat about tax rises. And so I think one of the strategic aims of this budget is to just try and draw a line underneath that finally. So that's what I'm picking up here.
And then what did you pick up from your conversation with Rachel Reeves? I mean, we've spent the last 15 minutes speculating about what she's thinking, what she actually said for definite.
Yeah, so I mean, what I found really interesting is this concept of sort of acknowledging that revenue rises, that extra tax rises are on the way. She felt I put a specific question to her about the manifesto promises, and that sort of dichotomy that Helen mentioned of like, is it going to be so big that she needs to break the manifesto commitments? I said, having seen the numbers that you have had that only you can have seen, are you still sticking to your manifesto commitments not to increase the big tax measures? And she said yes. So there's a bit of information there. She's also really doubled down on this idea that the budget will be used to help contain inflation. We had news from the IMF that UK inflation is set to be the highest in the G7 this year and next. And so she told me that part of the point of the budget would be targeted action to deal with cost of living challenges, and there's a shared job with the Bank of England, whose normally it's its job to target inflation, and the government to bear down further on some of the causes of inflation. Now, I'm led to believe that that means specifically regulated prices of bills that affect ordinary people, chiefly energy. So, we love a bit of budget speculation, but I'm always really cautious. But I'm giving the official sort of imprimatur here that this is real options now that they're looking at, which is to cut energy bills either via the surcharges that go on for a variety of reasons, taking them off, or it's definitely an option now to cut VAT on energy bills, which is currently 5%. You never would imagine they'd do that if they had no money left in the tank whatsoever. I haven't calculated how much that would cost actually in the back of my head, but I think it's quite interesting that that's still even an option at this point.
Right, Helen.
Yeah.
Economist through and through. What's your kind of gut reaction when you hear speculation about, help for people's energy bills? Because economists tend not to like handouts or big broad things like that intervene too much in the market.
Well, my initial thought is that we already have a system that's got on the tax side, a big contradiction in it. So on the one hand, the government has these taxes on electricity that are raised in order to fund renewable subsidies, all about net zero. But look at the VAT system, and we have this lower rate of VAT on energy related to other stuff. That's a subsidy. So one bit the tax system's incentivising it, one is taxing it, one bit's incentivising it. We already have this system that's just kind of at odds with each other. So then I hear, the proposal that maybe we can cut VAT further. Like, why would you do that? I mean, they're going to increase the subsidy within VAT, make VAT more complex and go in the wrong direction in my mind. So
but they do it because it would mean my electricity bill would go down.
Well, so I think if you're going to do the electricity thing, I think I'd much rather they looked at the kind of you have these taxes on electricity in order to fund renewables. You could absolutely reduce those. But let's think about that alongside why we had those, which was about net zero. So you can absolutely say, let's cut them. But let's think about in the round what we're trying to achieve here. Yes, obviously everyone wants the cost of living to come down. Everyone wants support. But let's not forget the reason they were there in the first place, and not be back here in a couple of years' time thinking, oh, that net zero thing, oh, we cut those taxes, what are we going to do now? We need a proper vision for how you're going to do the net zero thing through the tax system. And currently it's just bizarre how they're doing it.
But Faisal, this just reminds me of conversations we've had a few times in the last few months where we've both been speculating that we're going to start talking about the cost of living again because it's gone away from the headlines as a kind of crisis thing, but prices are still high because inflation, once it's happened, is permanent. And actually, it looks like inflation in certain things like food is going up again. Also, one of the other things that Helen's warning about in her green budget is economic growth slowing for the rest of the year.
Yes, and on inflation, there's a sort of particular psychological, sort of mass psychological impact here, which is because the population has seen such high levels of inflation in very recent memory, 10, 11%. Now that inflation has popped up again, 3.5% to 4%, those memories come back more quickly. And then this is the key thing. Do you start to adjust in your conversations with your bosses or as an employer or in shops? Do they suddenly think, well, actually inflation is going to be 4 or 5% for a year or two, therefore I expect it, therefore I'm going to ask for higher wages? And this is where the sort of the inflationary genie was ever fully put back in the bottle. And the question about the UK that is being asked is, why is the inflation higher? And I think this comes back to a question actually that the government wants to pose ahead of the budget, which is about whether there are some inefficiencies in the UK economy that affect growth, that affect productivity. What is the cause of this? They're leaning into this argument. My understanding is that the OBR, in their forecast, will strip out and detail why they're downgrading productivity, which we fully expect, and will put the blame on historical issues, including things like our trading arrangements. There'll be mentions of Brexit and the like. This is very interesting. So we may get some detailed account of why prices are stickier, why growth has been, a little bit moribund, and the government's choosing to lean into it. Why? Because they say that this change will reflect policy under the previous government. They're also arguing, they say it's not haggling with the OBR about all the policies they're putting in place on planning, all the things that might happen with artificial intelligence. And I think they're imploring them, don't do this now. Don't do this now when we could just be about to take off. Now, that's very hopeful. Everyone would say that. That's another important dimension of this argument that we will hear in the now sort of 6 weeks, I think, until the budget. There's still a lot of back and forth to go between the Treasury and the OBR. And I should say, definitely get a sign of, we've talked about this, about annoyance with the OBR, that they were the saviours for the incoming government. They were the thing that Liz Truss ignored. There is some irony that you definitely get more than a raised eyebrow, some flash of annoyance about this process with the OBR that's proving quite tricky.
Well, that's interesting what you're just saying there, that we're already getting ministers saying, oh, our economic inheritance from the last government was worse than we thought, which is a very August 2024 thing to be saying. And then, oh, the OBR and their slide rule way of managing the economy and politics doesn't help the country is a very sort of October 2022 thing to be saying, which adds to the whole Groundhog Day theme. Fantastic. Helen, just before you go, the thing that really jumps out at me from all the IFS analysis today is not any of the numbers or what's happening with the economy or what's happening with borrowing. It's that the phrase Rachel Reeves' second budget. There's been so much speculation about everything Rachel Reeves does. It feels like she's delivered 15 of these already.
Yeah.
And she's only delivered one budget since being Chancellor.
She has. And look, let me just tell you why.
Which of course means we're about to have a 50% increase in the number of budgets she's delivered.
Exactly. That's it. Yeah, exactly. Plenty of change. But also, everyone's got their own analogy that they like for this horrible cycle we're in. So Faisal mentioned doom loop, some people like hamster wheel. Let me tell you why I like the Groundhog Day analogy. It's simply because we're stuck in this thing where we didn't want to be here, obviously, but we are. And, Fazel's absolutely right to say the government's going to point to previous governments, and the reason that productivity is low is not to do, with what Rachel Reeves has done particularly. She had a dire inheritance. But she knew that last year, and she absolutely would have known that giving herself a teeny tiny headroom was going to leave her exposed to this happening. So, maybe it's the productivity not her fault, but the fact she gave herself no room is her fault. But if you think of the Groundhog Day film, how does that end? It ends when you change your behaviour. It ends when you stop doing the things you were doing that were keeping you in Groundhog Day. So if you want to not be here next year, we shouldn't do the same things again, because doing the same things again, leaving yourself a small headroom, tying all your hands on tax policy, means there's a decent chance we will be here again, whether it's in spring or next autumn. So I think, break out of Groundhog Day has to mean you do something different.
Be so intriguing to see if in the next 10 days Groundhog Day shoots back up the charts on the streamers. We'll see just how influential the IFS is. We're often talked of as an influential think tank, but normally in the fiscal space. Let's see if you can do movies now. Helen, thank you very much.
Thank
and
you for
welcome.
having me.
Welcome to the national stage, or welcome
Thank
back because you've been on it before. And Faisal, safe travels back from Washington.
Yeah, I'm going to Pennsylvania to see Punxsutawney. What was he called, Tom?
Phil.
Groundhog.
Phil.
Of course, there we go.
No point in the pub quiz for Faisal. Now, I'm not sure what Frank Gardener, our security correspondent, was doing on the 16th of October 2024, but today he has been at MI5 headquarters, the Domestic Security Service in London, seeing the Director General, Ken McCallum, who was doing his annual speech where he assesses the security threats facing the UK. And of course, this speech is happening against the backdrop of the political furore over the collapsed Chinese spying case, where, of course, the two people who were charged deny the allegations against them. And to explain what the head of MI5 was saying, Frank is here in the studio. Hello, Frank.
Hello, Adam.
What a day and what a week for the Director General of MI5 to be doing his annual talk that he does with security journalists.
Yes. Somebody let slip that actually his speech had to be amended more than once. I mean, to be fair, there have been two major significant events in their sphere that I think will have led to that. One was the Manchester synagogue attack, and he went to some lengths, actually. 3 times he expressed his sympathies for the bereaved, the injured, the affected.
And he talked in general terms about the relationship with China, which of course was the subject of lots of discussion when we were all reading those witness statements from the Deputy National Security Advisor very late on Wednesday night. What was Ken McCallum's take on the relationship between the UK and China?
Well, he admitted that it's a complex one because, of course, it is a huge trading partner for the UK, an investor. And, I often say to people, hands up everybody in the audience who's got anything useful made in Russia. And if you're saying vodka, it doesn't count. It was made in Sweden or Warrington. But, ask the same question about China. And so much of our daily lives, China is involved in the supply chain, whether it's in the chips or in some form. Our cars, our computers, our phones, our daily lives are completely hardwired to China. And China is a major investor in this country. So you can't divorce yourself from China. So it's a complex relationship. At the same time, he was very clear. He said that Chinese state actors, and I always think this is a weird term for somebody who you see as a threat, because it makes them sound like they're part of some grand national opera. But, Chinese state actors present a daily threat to UK national security. They're not the only ones. So does Russia, so does Iran. But he was very explicit about that. He said that this is in the fields of cyber espionage, of hacking, of trying to lure academics to get secrets out of them.
And he said that MI5 had interrupted a plot based in China or originating from China or related to China this week.
Yes. Just in the last week, he said, operationally, they had intervened. He didn't want to go into details. I didn't get the impression it was anything to do with the row over that particular spy trial or alleged spy trial.
Not to fixate on these statements that we got from the trial last night, from the Deputy National Security Advisor, but it does sound like the head of MI5 and he have got quite similar approaches to how you describe China, which is be worried about it, but work with them. And actually, Ken McCallum says, even on security, you've got working with them is better than just working against them or just being scared of them.
Yeah, I think that's the case. So there's a big difference, I think, between the way the UK views Russia and the way the UK views China. So with Russia, relations really are absolutely rock bottom. With China, there is this sort of really paradoxical twin approach. And what he basically said today, and we all had a kind of lock-in there inside MI5 headquarters in Thames House. I mean, the place, it was a packed, it was mostly journos, but there were spooks wall to wall hanging around, literally around the walls.
Right.
His view is that the more we talk to China, the more effective it'll be when we confront them on something where we have to say, look, this is not on what you're doing here. But, they've got the numbers, China. They've got a vast number of people working in IT, in intellectual property, in AI. He did mention AI, and this is a really important thing because, if you and I are having this conversation, and I hope we do, over the next few months, we are increasingly going to be talking about artificial intelligence and eventually something called artificial general intelligence, where it overtakes our own intelligence. And China is in a full head-on race with the United States on this one, which will affect us.
Although it was interesting reading his remarks about AI, they're very kind of general. Like, he doesn't pick out specific things that we should be worried about or specific uses of AI that might be coming down the track that we're all going to have to get used to or that he's working on to counter. It was quite generalized.
I think because he's got enough on his hands with counterterrorism and Iran and Russia and China. So, he's got his hands full. There's only so much that somebody can do, I think, and his teams can do.
And actually the thrust of his speech was this huge increase of state-related activity against the UK. So not gone are the days, because they still exist, of your lone wolf terrorists or your terrorist networks like Al-Qaeda, but it's also now, lots more work directed by Iran, Russia, potentially China.
Yeah, I mean, look, I can remember in the early 2000s doing a program on counterespionage, and I was allowed to interview the head of counterespionage in MI5. And he was coming to the end of his career, and he said, I can tell you, and this would have been about 2008, he said, actually, the level of Russian espionage in this country is right back now to where it was in the Cold War. They will go to great lengths to acquire something through intelligence means covertly, when often it's out there on the internet, that they will sort of wine and dine somebody who works in aerospace where actually all the details are up there online anyhow. Yeah. But it's very different now, post the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, where, we are in a sort of sub-threshold, grey zone. I refuse to call it.
What do you mean sub-threshold?
Sorry, well, okay, this is...
It's an interesting piece of jargon, yeah.
It is, yeah. It's kind of grey zone, hybrid. There are a number of actions that Russia is undertaking, not just against the UK, but against the West, scoping out undersea cables, data cables, these mysterious drones that are appearing at Copenhagen Airport, Oslo Airport, Munich Airport. Very hard to actually ascribe them, but then a lot of cyber probing. These are sort of what's called sub-threshold, in other words, things that are making life uncomfortable for us in the West, but nobody actually gets killed by them, and it stops short of being a kind of attributable act of war.
And also, I mean, this is a bit of a daft question, but like, what's the head of MI5 like as a person? Because we obviously don't see him very often, the rest of us.
He's got suspiciously dark hair for somebody of his. I mean, I said to one of his minions today, why hasn't he gone grey in this job? Every time I see him, which is about twice a year that we
might be a disguise.
Well, it could be. Apparently, he's totally bald. No, he's actually very personable. I mean, he was clearly, he strode in there today and was very serious, read from this prepared script, and looked dead ahead, didn't look anybody in the eyes, read from the script in front of him. And then he relaxed a bit and took questions. And he's very human. And, you've got to imagine that somebody in that job, how do they sleep at night? They see stuff that we don't, that you and I have no idea. People probably imagine that in this job, I've been security correspondent at the BBC for 23 years. People imagine that I sort of know all sorts of things which I can't talk about. Yeah. I really don't. If I do, I broadcast them. End of.
Although I suppose the thing with Ken McCallum is, as he says in his own words in this speech, he's MI5 born and bred. He spent his whole life doing this, and he rose up through the organisation.
Which makes me think of this sort of baby coming out that's sort of got a classification.
In dark glasses.
It's already been vetted before it even reaches the pram. That's interesting you mentioned that, though, because he made that point to say, look, just in case the way I interpret that is that he wanted people to know that in case anybody thought that MI5 would shy away from pushing forward evidence for a prosecution if they had presented a state or a threat or any threat to UK national security, they're not going to do that, regardless of the politics.
Which is interesting, and it comes back to that point about, as you said, his delivery of this speech. It's very precise and every word matters, and it's because he doesn't say a lot in public. So when he does, every word is weighed up very carefully to send a message, either explicit or implicit or very subtle. Frank, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And that's all for this episode of Newscast. But just as we're about to wrap up, we get some breaking news from Washington, D.C. Donald Trump has been on the phone to Vladimir Putin for 2 hours, and they have agreed to have face-to-face talks about Ukraine in Hungary in the near future. And Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, will get the ball rolling with some face-to-face talks with the Russians sometime next week. So that's just breaking right now as we finish recording at 6:45 on Thursday, the 16th of October. But I'm about to make the TV show of Newscast, which is on BBC One after Question Time. And we've got some very seasoned international politics observers who will be able to work out what might be going on. So you'll be able to see that on BBC One after Question Time on Thursday night. And you'll be able to listen to that as the podcast edition of Newscast on Friday. But thanks for listening to this edition of Newscast. Bye-bye.